I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behavior Speak. In this conversation, Jessica Huancacuri discusses her research on the Quechua people of Peru and the complexities of identity, adoption, and cultural context. Jessica shares her research on Indigenous learning practices, focusing on the roles of mothers and grandmothers in children's education. We also explore the rich mathematical practices embedded in Quechua culture, emphasizing how everyday activities reflect deep mathematical understanding. Jessica also highlights the importance of language and identity within Quechua communities, particularly in the Diaspora, and Jessica's aspirations to create inclusive educational media that represents Indigenous perspectives. All right, welcome, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge I'm producing this podcast on the territories of the Kalamaklehus, Homoko, and Comox First Nations. And I'm grateful to be here. So, Jessica, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a doctoral student in the developmental psych program at NYU. My research mainly focuses on the Quechua Runa, who are an ancestral indigenous people of the Andean highlands, how they socialize their children, and how their children's early STEM learning is developed and supported in the home, the community, and through children's media. I also have a bachelor's and a master's degree in psychology from the City College of New York.
That's awesome. What sort of sparked your interest to get into developmental psychology?
Yeah, so I've been, as I mentioned, I have a bachelor's and a master's degree just in like general psychology, but my favorite course that I took while I was in both my undergrad and my graduate programs was developmental psychology. I really enjoyed, thinking about how we as, individuals are consistently developing, and how that happens throughout all stages of life. A lot of times people think that developmental psychology is focused on children because that's when a lot of our development is happening. But I mean, in reality, we're constantly developing until, the end of our lives. So I think it's a really interesting field that like broadly spans all, stages of life. For me, I am particularly interested in children and how they develop. But yeah, I think it's just a really rich, broad field that you can investigate so many different types of research, lines of inquiry.
Yeah, I would have just sort of presumed it's all about kids as well. I wouldn't have thought of it as a lifespan science.
I think there is a lot of research about, and it's an emerging field. From what I know, which is not a lot. I'm no expert. I mean, there's this widespread belief that I always talk about there, or this myth that kind of was spread that the brain stops developing at age 25. It's like when you're 25, the brain no longer develops. But I mean, if you really think about that, it's like, how could that be true? Like, what else stops developing in your body? Like nothing. So why would the brain stop developing? It is true that certain things happen, and I'm no brain, I'm no neuroscience. It is true that certain things do happen in the brain at that time, but to make a broad statement that the brain stops developing is just factually untrue. So when I investigate, at least in my line of research for, just how people believe that their children learn and develop, I am interviewing people as old as like 80 something or 90 something. Because in the Quechua community, there's many well, like all communities, but a lot of times, at least what's prevalent in my community is that grandmothers are spending a lot of time with children, and they're actually, they have a lot of influence in their children's early life and development. So that's why when I interview them, why I chose to interview them is because they do play this kind of supporting role. I mean, I grew up in the US, and like my grandmother did not play that kind of supporting role in terms of my learning and my development. But not to say that that doesn't happen in communities in the US here. I mean, I was adopted, so my cultural context is a little bit different. So yeah, but in terms of people who are thinking about, I mean, developmental psychologists do study adults who, are at different stages of their lives and their development processes. I just, like, from what I'm familiar with my own like program of research in terms of the students and also the faculty. No, but I know that it is something that happens.
Okay, so a lot of research focuses on the Quechua. Can you tell me who are they and sort of what sparked your interest in kind of doing research in this area?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I mentioned, I am adopted. So I was adopted into white European descent family from New York. I grew up on Long Island, and that was, the context for which I was raised in and grew up in and was socialized in. But I am actually from Abancay, Peru, which has a large population of Quechua Runa. Runa just means people. So really, I'm saying Quechua people, but the Quechua, as we think of ourselves, we just think of ourselves as Runa. We don't it's not really like us thinking of ourselves as Quechua people, because before colonization, that was who we were. And it was only post colonization, all these like labels and identifiers. We were just,
Sure.
we were people. Um, so say more about that. So Quechua people are people who there are Quechua speakers, for example, throughout South America. So predominantly, I would say they're concentrated in Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, but there are also Quechua speakers in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, and communities who exist in those countries. The Quechua language was a language of the Incan Empire, but it wasn't. The Quechua people are not the only people, or even the predominant group of people who existed again prior to the Incan empire, and then also post colonization. So today I would say we are an indigenous group of people who live throughout Latin America. And Quechua people identify themselves in a number of different ways, and they may identify themselves as Quechua, they may not, but oftentimes your identity to Quechua is tied through either your use of the language, so you're a Quechua speaker, so that is often tied to being seen as Quechua. But in Latin America, it's very hard to say if Quechua people identify themselves as Quechua. That is kind of like a Western label. And then also, again, I come from a Western context, being adopted, in a Western way in which I identify myself, the people in which I study, which is my own community. So it's kind of like hard to say or to put like that label on that doesn't come from like a Western way.
Right.
When I did some of my first qualitative studies, what I was interested in looking at was how Quechua people themselves identify, whether or not that they say that they're Quechua. And to be honest, I didn't get a lot of responses that were like, I identify as a Quechua person. It was like, well, I identify as like, a campesino or an abanquina. In Latin America, a lot of times you identify yourself by the country in which you come from, the city in which you come from. Like if you're from Lima, you're going to be different from a person who's from Abancay or from
See.
Ayacucho, or someone who's maybe from the campo, smaller like rural communities. And that is often where, at least in the Andean highlands, where Quechua is more widely spoken. But there are many indigenous languages also that are spoken throughout Peru, and many other indigenous groups that exist in Peru, most notably like the Aymara, for example, and then also the many indigenous groups that exist in the Amazon. So a lot of things going on there.
Yeah, for sure. And so you said the Quechua people, wouldn't have identified as that. So where did the term come from? Like, is the term the name of the language that they called it, or is it a Western term?
Quechua is Quechua, I guess, is, you could say it's a Western term, because to say Quechua in the language Quechua, for example, is Runa Simi. So again, Runa means people, Simi means like mouth. So if you were to try to translate that into
Gotcha.
English, it's like the people's language. You could, yeah,
Gotcha. Okay,
yeah.
and so Quechua is sort of not sort of is you are Quechua, correct?
Yes, I identify as Quechua.
But adopted at 3 months, you obviously you weren't raised in that culture. So when did you kind of first start discovering or learning about your roots?
Sure. So this I think is very important, actually, like a contextualization of me and my like cultural context and
Yes.
experiences. So I was very lucky in that my adoptive parents were able to meet my biological mother. So when they met her, they immediately realized that she was indigenous and that she spoke Quechua, because actually, the translator that they had brought along, because my parents don't speak Spanish, they don't speak Quechua. The translator that the adoption lawyer had brought along only spoke Spanish. So my parents like realized and understood. And my dad is also like a person who's like just like he's interested in history, he's interested in indigenous culture. So he was able to have kind of that understanding of that my mother was an indigenous person from Latin America. And also they were able to realize that, oh, she doesn't speak Spanish. So there's like something different here. And I think that has influenced my identity forever. So to get back to the story, so they realized that the translator, didn't speak Quechua. My parents are very like outgoing, friendly people who just like talk to anybody. So they had actually made friends with someone in the hotel that they were staying at, a bartender who he was learning English. So he was chatting with them, but he also knew Quechua because he was from the campo, from a rural area. So my parents actually engaged him to like translate. So it was going from like Spanish to it was going from Quechua from the bartender and my mom to Spanish for him to the translator, and then the translator would translate in English to my parents. So that experience made them very aware that this is a woman who speaks Quechua. She's a Quechua woman. So all my life, because of that experience, I was told that I was Quechua. And the way that my dad explained it to me, I have, again, a memory of my dad explaining it to me rather than my mom, just because this is like an interest of my dad's. He said, you're indigenous, like Native Americans. So, and when he's saying that, he's saying like, Native Americans from the USA. He was like, you're like a Native American, but you just happen to be from the other America, because it's all right? So he's like from South America. So I grew up with that like forever. Like that was how I understood myself. And then
Amazing.
then as I started to like become older and then realize that like so this is like getting into a whole wider discussion about like Latinidad and how people identify in terms of being from Latin America. Like this label of like Latina or being Latino was a little bit confusing to me, because I was like, but I'm indigenous, like I'm like Native American, but from Latin America. And that also like has forever confused people. So I grew up on Long Island and not like a super diverse area. So like it was also confusing for people to understand me as I was identifying, because I would be like, I'm from Peru, and people would be like, oh, like Latina. I was like, but no, like I'm actually like from this like Native group, this indigenous group. And like that was very confusing, but for others. But for me, identity was never confusing. And in fact, all of these, like kind of like what we're talking about, right? Like all of these different labels that are created for us, whether that be, in Latin America or in the US, and then are put onto us, can kind of sometimes be confusing. For everyone involved. So yeah, that is like how I have always understood like my cultural context, and how I identify. So that being said, now getting connected with my family, and everything, like if I were to say to my mama, my biological mother, like, oh, I'm Quechua, she might like laugh, because like, well, I don't even like speak Quechua fluently per se. So how am I going to call myself Quechua? But that, opens up into a wider discussion of, how do we identify? Who has the right to identify as, indigenous? Is it about lived experience? Is it about DNA? I mean, and indigenous people are also not homogenous, and we all have very different definitions about like, what constitutes or what makes up or what allows people to identify as indigenous. But I mean, the most important thing for me is like that we're autonomous in making that decision, and we're moving away from like letting things like governments or, like blood quantum or anybody else defining us. And we can choose to define ourselves, and whether or not we hold like lived experience to be important, language to be important, all of these different, things to be important. For me, the lived experience piece is a little bit hard because I was forcibly removed from my community. So like, it's really hard for me when people say like, oh, it's about lived experience. And while I agree to an extent, it kind of leaves me to be like, well, like I'm still going to identify as Quechua and as indigenous in my way. Like, how can I not? My mom is a monolingual Quechua speaker, Yeah. So that is, again, my context.
Do you have a credential with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or would like a certificate of attendance for another organization, you can earn continuing education units by going to www.behaviorspeak.com, clicking on CEUs, and entering the 3 secret words. The first secret word is Quechua. Quechua. Yeah, and so have you since met any of your biological family?
Yeah, so I am connected with my biological mom. We've been in reunion for like a decade.
Amazing.
It's incredible. It was a great experience. I also have 5 siblings on that side. I'm the sixth, the youngest, who I've also been in reunion with, and they have
Wow.
children. So I have like tons of nieces and nephews. And then
Wow.
for my dad, I am also lucky enough to be in reunion with him. And I say lucky enough because we met when he was 89 years old. So I haven't been in reunion as long with him. I've only been in reunion with him for a couple of years. And I'm very lucky to have eventually found him. My parents are not together. My biological parents are not together anymore. So I found him later. Yes, we've been in reunion for a couple of years now. And I also have many siblings on that side as well, around, I would say, like 15 at least.
Wow.
Yeah. So I've been in reunion with that side for less time, but yes, and I've met a number of my siblings, not all of them. So yeah, that but I've been in like general reunion in terms of like going back to Peru and also being in reunion with my country and my city and where I was born for about a decade now, and it's been really great.
And so when did you first? I mean, that's amazing connecting with all these folks. When did you first meet your siblings?
So I met my siblings, yeah, about 10 years ago, same time with my mom. In fact, 2 of my siblings came to the Cusco airport to pick me up with my mom, and that was when I first met them. And then when we got to Abancay, which is about like 5 hours drive from Cusco, then I met all my other siblings, except for I did have one sibling who she lives in the Amazon, so I didn't reunion with her that year, but I reunioned with her the following year. Yeah, so I met them kind of like all at the same time, and yeah, same thing with my dad's side. When I met my dad, I met my siblings.
So your 5 siblings are in Peru then?
Yes, all of my siblings are in Peru. I actually don't have any siblings in the US. I'm an only child here.
And I understand if you don't want to share and happy to edit out, but curious, why did you leave?
Why did I leave Peru? Like, what was the reason for my adoption?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I don't mind sharing.
Sure.
From what I know, and I say from what I know because although I have, asked my mom a number of different questions, it's a very difficult topic for her.
I bet.
Yeah, because, it was an emotional decision. So from what I've heard, what she told me is she was told that like the birth of me was going to cause her to, like, she was going to die in childbirth, her doctor was telling her. So her doctor was like, listen, like, this is really serious. Like, we think there's a high chance of you dying in childbirth. So you should probably look into arranging an adoption. And this was at a time in Peru when like adoptions are very high. So he told her, like, you should look into arranging an adoption for your, my mother, her first husband had died and she had broken up with my father. And so she was alone and she had 5 other children. So they had told her, like, you should really look into arranging an adoption for me, the baby that she was pregnant with. And then also even maybe like my sister, was only a couple of years older than I am. So she was like 2 at the time, maybe two
Got
and a
it.
half. And they told her, like, you really need to like look into this, like, because you're it's very likely that you will die in childbirth. So and then they told her like a little bit about adoption, that framing adoption in the way that many people understand it, like, oh, your child could have a better life and you're probably gonna die anyway. So yeah, so she agreed to the adoption on those conditions. Now, I mean, obviously, she did not die in childbirth. So she feels, and this is her personal feelings, and I don't know, I wasn't there, but she feels like, and I do think that her feelings for this are actually valid. And I'll say, after I say this, she feels a little bit deceived because basically told like 100%, like, you're gonna die.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, she had a lot of health complications, throughout the rest of her life, and whether or not that was related specifically to my birth, or the fact that she, had gone through like 6 births, which is a lot of births. Well, actually 7. I do have a sibling who passed away while he was in infancy, so 7 births at the time. She had gone through, so it could have been complications for that as well. I don't know too much about that. I have myself never been pregnant or anything like that, so I don't know too much about these things, but yeah, she feels a bit deceived by it. And also she has a friend, a very close friend of hers, that who was pregnant with her at the same time, who was told the same thing by the doctor, who also did not die in childbirth, and they actually have never been in reunion with their child. They are looking for them, but they have never been in reunion with them. So
Wow.
I think that there is like some. Well, I mean, this is just my own personal opinion, but yeah, like I think that there is like some validity to the fact that she feels deceived. Not only it was her, but her friend who she knows of, who they worked at the same doctor. There was the same lawyer who facilitated the adoption. Both of them are, still very much alive. Like I've met this woman, and she is very much alive, and they both feel these negative feelings towards the adoption. And
Of
that's like,
course.
what she talks about. And we don't talk about it too much because it's a very painful time. It's also like a very difficult time for my country in general. I mean, it was the shining path, which is in the 80s, and the 90s was, like that she was still enduring and feeling the effects of all of that. And again, I don't know too much about that, not having grown up there. I understand it was a difficult time in her life. And also it's hard for her to remember certain things, not only because they're traumatic, but also they happened like a long time ago. And we in our relationship don't focus a lot on like the negative like past, but like the hopeful future and the things that we've been able to do since we've been in reunion.
Wow, what a story. It does make you wonder if there are more out there besides your mother's friend that have had this experience.
Yeah, there definitely is. I mean, unfortunately, adoption is not always ethical. Yeah, like I mean, my own personal feelings on adoption are, yeah, like it's definitely not always ethical. Although there are cases that it can be, but yeah, a lot of times it isn't, for reasons like my mom's, or other reasons that have existed. I've also heard of much worse stories of other adoptees that I know of that have had, it's a very clear case of like deceiving, and they're, like I have a friend whose mom was basically told that like her baby had died, and
Wow.
but really the baby was like effectively stolen and then adopted out. Yeah, so and then that, when that adoptee, my friend, she tried to she reunioned with her family. It was like extremely confusing for them because they were like, but you died. So like there's much more, to me, much more clear cut cases of um this kind of corruption. Mine is like a little bit like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just sharing what I know and what has been told to me by my mom.
Well, and this really echoes a lot of the stories I've been hearing on the podcast, interviewing folks in Indigenous folks in Canada about this phenomenon called the '60s scoop,
Right.
where in the night in the night it wasn't just in the 1960s, but it kind of started then and kind of all the way up till now, where
Right.
Indigenous children were essentially, I like the term you use, forcibly removed from their
Mhm.
families and adopted out, and not just adopted out, sort of down the road, but like adopted out internationally quite often, and often moving from sort of northern Canadian provinces into southern American states. And I think similar stories told that they were dead or gone, or the parents were dead or gone, and neither being true. Yeah, I mean, folks are still reeling today from all of this.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. Yeah, I am aware of that as well. And yeah, I mean, a lot of times it is us being forcibly removed from our communities. I mean, I consider myself as being like kind of forcibly removed from my
Yeah.
community. There was no supports in place to help my mom, even if she wanted to, even if she wasn't told that maybe she would die or anything like that. There's just no regardless, she didn't have a lot of support just in general. She was already a single mom with 5 other kids and another one on the way, and there's just not a lot of social support. I mean, I personally feel there's not a lot of social support for moms anywhere,
Exactly.
at least in North America, or South America for that, in that case. So yeah. I feel, yeah, there just wasn't a lot of support for her. She didn't have a lot of support.
Wow. Okay, so how does this all kind of tie into the research you're doing?
Right. Yeah. So for me, I was definitely personally motivated to, I'd been in reunion at that point for like a couple of years, less than 5, but a couple, with my community, and I was thinking of doing a PhD in something, but I was interested in developmental psychology, and I had met my mentor, who was my advisor now, who's wonderful, who's Peruvian actually. So I was like interested in studying my community, and it kind of like there's a bit of a selfish motivation, right? It's almost like understanding maybe the life that I would have had I, been able to stay in Peru,
Ah,
um,
yeah.
and be raised there and be raised in Abancay, because I was born in Abancay. So kind of like, but try to imagine my childhood, and maybe try to understand it that way. But also, given that so we talked about adoption negatively, but adoption has also afforded me the opportunity and privilege to be able to, pursue something like higher education. Like my biological mom didn't go to formal schooling. So for me to have the opportunity to pursue the highest form of education, an advanced degree on the level of like a PhD or like an MD, or, law, like that level of law degree, like that type of degree is a very privileged experience. And I feel a responsibility to honor, where I came from in that. And it's just a reality that Indigenous communities in general are not very represented in developmental science. So thinking of that, and then also again thinking of my own selfish motivations, but also thinking of that, is there hasn't been a lot of research on Indigenous communities just in general, in terms of the things and the questions that I'm asking in my research, and not on Indigenous communities specifically in Latin America. Specifically in places like, the global south, which includes Latin America. A lot of the research, and again, I think this is just because a lot of these a lot of the research that exists on Indigenous groups is oftentimes from countries where English is the dominant language.
Of course. Yeah.
Which makes sense. I mean,
Yep.
because English, unfortunately, is like the language of academia, right? A lot of research that does exist on Indigenous groups, again, tends to focus on Indigenous groups from North America, let's say, or from the South Pacific, let's say. And there's less attention on Indigenous groups, again, from the global South, or maybe from countries where English isn't also spoken. So in Latin America, Spanish is the dominant language that's spoken. Right. So I was really interested in broadening also like our view of child development to include perspectives of these communities, because ultimately, if we want to have an equitable definition of what we consider to be theories on child development, and theories on how communities everywhere support children's early STEM learning, for me specifically now it's been early math learning, we need to also consider groups that we have not, that unfortunately haven't been able to be considered in the conversation before.
Absolutely. You've been focusing on STEM learning, and you said early math learning. What kind of sparked your interest in focusing on math?
Yeah, so I think it's two things. So I will be honest, like my advisor was she's a language and literacy expert. She was making the transition to kind of more STEM focused things. So when she said that, I was also interested in that, because just based on my own personal observations of my community, I feel we're a deeply mathematical people. Now, but what I mean by that is maybe not, and again, we all have our own biases about how we imagine like mathematical people, or maybe mathematicians to be. And I don't necessarily mean, because I mean, even for me, when I think about a mathematician, I'm thinking about like the first person that comes to my mind I'm seeing is Einstein, who is a man, who is Western. That's like the person that I'm imagining. So, but what I mean in terms of my own community is we're a deeply mathematical people, maybe not in a way in which you think of formal academic math that is taught in school. But we are using math every day. So my mom is a weaver. She weaves a lot. And like I said, she unfortunately did not have the opportunity to attend formal schooling. But when I see her weave, I see that she is doing like, and I know that she is doing these amazing, like she's engaging like amazing like spatial skills, pattern recognition skills, and all of it's being done in her head. It's not like she's looking at a picture in a book and she's copying a pattern. She is
Sure.
copying a pattern that was taught to her through, learning and observing it, and, through generations. It's a pre-colonial tradition, us engaging and weaving. So that's something that's present maybe in the older generations, maybe less so in the younger generations, but the younger generations are much more, or at least, everybody engages in math in their daily lives. Aside from the Quechua Runa, we are often engaging in math in ways that like we don't think of. Like when you're walking somewhere, you're engaging in spatial relations, or when you're going to the store, you're like doing math. And that is a lot of what is happening, at least in Abancay. Children they go to the store like alone at like 3, which, I was raised in New York, which is like that would have never happened here. But I see, like my young nephew, he's going to school. He's going to the store. He's, picking up like some rice, and he knows the amount that needs to be weighed, the amount that he needs to get, the amount of money that he pays for it. And he's like, before he goes to preschool,
Yeah.
going, and he's doing that. And I think that we, as a community in Abancay, the children and also just everyone is engaging with math in a very like way in which that you engage in it through like, your everyday routines or activities. So I was very interested in like kind of also bringing attention to not only Indigenous, peoples, but also the different ways in which we do math. So the math that's present kind of in the home and the everyday. So less of a focus on like the math that we know is present and is happening in like environments and contexts like schools, but more so the math that's happening like in the home or in the community. And that can be through, like media even, or that can be through, again, just, going to the store, doing all sorts of, things that are not in a formal educational context. So I was also interested in kind of like shedding light on that, because that is and it's like, there's a lot, there's a lot of research out on math in the home environment. So I was interested in exploring all of the things that people have found in other communities in the Quechua Runa community.
I appreciate that. I certainly have the bias, and I think most folks listening will have the bias. Sort of the math is, the chalkboard and and the numbers and the equations, and and the fellows with pocket protectors, and Big Bang Theory or whatever, kind of doing their thing, and the idea that math really shows up in sort of every aspect of our being is interesting. So what are some of the other ways that kind of math shows up in kind of Quechua culture?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, like I said, like in everyday interactions, just in terms of like going to the store, like so that's like anyone, right? So I think we had a lot of math that shows up in weaving. We have a lot of math that shows up in terms of just like being in campo. Like I mean, in Abancay, some people are in campo more than others because again, it's a city, but it's also very close to campo. Many families, including my own, have houses in campo as well, where they go and they tend to the land. So in campo, in the rural areas, like math can be, like you're counting your chickens, for example. You are, recognizing and classifying your animals based on the different types of patterns that they might have. So like you might have a pig with like, 3 spots and a pig with 2 spots, and you're identifying and recognizing them in those ways. You are, there's a lot of like sale of animals, or even, I mean, I even see that in Avocado. There's a lot of like sale of animals, so calculating the prices for that. There's a lot of like exchanging and I mean, like here in New York, I feel like I use my like debit card for everything. Still in Avangai and in the markets especially, you're using like money, like like coin money. So like just going to the market and purchasing something with the coin money, and then like if you're like a vendor, which a lot of people are, a lot of people do work in the market, including my own family. I have also worked at the market, helping to sell my family's. We have a house in Campo in the rural areas. We grow spinach, so like selling spinach in the market. And then when you're doing that, like you have to make change like in your head. There's no like register. I mean, I worked as as a cashier. That's my very first job.
Hmm.
When I was in high school. And, like you put the money, you put the calculation in, you put, the computer adds it all up for you after you scan all the items at the grocery store. And then you put the amount of money that the customer gives to you. And then the computer tells you, like, this is the amount of change that you give back. But like
Hmm.
when you're in the marketplace, for example, and you're vendoring, there's no like cash registers. So you're either doing that in your head. I mean, mostly it's done in the head. I have not really seen people like take out a calculator and be like, except for me, except for me,
Hmm.
I'm the only one who's doing that because I'm, so very much reliant on that. Yeah, but yeah, these are things again that they're doing in their head. And like I said, my mom has worked at the market, and she's never went to formal schooling, and these are things that
Hmm.
she learned through again these like daily life interactions.
The second secret word is Latinidad. Latinidad. That's fascinating. So tell me more then about the specific kind of research you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So I have, in terms of like the work that I have done for my doctoral research, I have done now two separate qualitative studies. The first one was a qualitative study with mothers and grandmothers in which I investigated. Well, actually, I guess technically I did. It was a little bit informal, but a first like observational study where I just like very much like an ethnographic study, like just observed two families, like two neighbors of my mother to see like who is like what's going on in families and in families' homes. And they very graciously, allowed me to be in their home and to observe them. And immediately what I noticed is like, wow, there's like a lot of people that are like, like families are either they're living in multi-generational homes where the
Hmm.
grandmother or the grandparents are living with the parent with the mom and the dad and the child, or the grandmother is like coming over every day and she lives
Hmm.
very nearby. Aunts and uncles are coming over a lot. Cousins are
Hmm.
together much more. So these are the things that I observed. Like the
Hmm.
very first where I was just like observing and trying to get a lay of the land and see like, okay, what can I focus on here? And I was immediately interested, as I said, in this dynamic of grandmothers. Usually it's grandmothers
Hmm.
who are like very interested in the children's learning and development because they're spending a lot of time with the children. Like I know even in my own family, like my sister would say that like my mama like raised her like oldest. Yeah,
Hmm.
because she's busy working. So I was like, okay, like I think I want to like look at different than the typical dyads, right? Because a lot of family research is about the mom and the dad, at least in Western context, which makes sense. So I wanted to kind of broaden and expand that and actually look at the dyad of like mothers and grandmothers.
Hmm.
So in for my first study, I looked at mothers and grandmothers and their thoughts and beliefs about like their identity, thoughts and beliefs about, like city life and rural life, and also mainly thoughts and beliefs about, the Quechua language, the Spanish language,
Hmm.
and then focusing primarily on their beliefs about children's socialization and learning, just
Hmm.
generally. So nothing about math yet. So I did qualitative semi-structured interviews, which is, I asked a question like, how do you think children learn?
Hmm.
And it's semi-structured. So what that means is then like I would follow up based on like what they said. If they said I think that children learn through multiple different ways, and then they didn't say anything else, I would be like,
Hmm.
oh, what different ways? Yeah, So trying to probe and like follow lines of inquiry in which that I thought were interesting. So yeah, I did a number of interviews, moms and grandmothers about that. And then the second study that I did is, drawing back on what I said, my first sort of observations was that many family members are interested, involved in children's development and learning. I decided to focus on moms, but then also like anyone who they felt was like it's like a primary caregiver. So a primary caregiver is usually the mom. Although I did
Hmm.
have two dads who were the primary caregivers in this second study.
Hmm.
So usually the moms, and then a secondary caregiver. So sometimes that was like a grandmother, but oftentimes it was maybe even like an older sibling. Who was like 19 years old or 15 years old, who was the secondary caregiver. And this was because the study focused on math. So a lot of times I found or noticed and observed that older siblings often are helping younger siblings with math homework maybe more than like a grandmother is, just because they've just been through it, right? Like they're only a couple years older, they're familiar with the concept that they're much more like readily familiar. Like right now, I don't know, like I would be the best person to help my nephew with his math homework. Probably his older brother would be, because again, he just sort of went through that math, that the math that they're learning. So I decided I wanted to focus on primary and secondary caregivers, but the secondary caregivers again didn't have to be grandmothers. It could be an older sibling, a cousin, anyone really. And this study was focused on thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes and practices surrounding math. So I would ask questions like, how do you feel about math? Do you like math? Do you feel like you're good at math? What do you think math is like useful for? And then I would say, like, how do you think math is present in your daily life, in your child's life? Or, if it wasn't the primary caregiver, I would say like in your sibling's life, cousin's life, what have you. Yeah. So that was what the second study was focused on. And then hopefully for a third study, I'm interested in media. So yeah, for the third study, I'm going to focus on like co-design and development of educational media, because I think that's also an interesting context in which math is present. It's a home context. So I'm hopefully going to be able to co-design educational media with families that will represent, as I was saying, like an average, like daily mathematical life of a child within Abancay, and kind of put that together in like a digital media format. And then I'm interested in seeing, how that like creation of that has kind of influenced and shaped their thoughts and beliefs about math, and also their math identities. Like I was saying, like how we perceive, ourselves to like the general perception of who is a math person, who is a math doer, who is a math learner. So I'm interested in seeing like if that has any effects on their perceptions of that. And then ultimately what I would love to do is then show that digital educational media that we've created together to children, and then see if that also has the same, an effect or an influence on how children perceive themselves as math doers or learners.
All this work, the subjects were all in your hometown, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so is because you talked a lot earlier on about sort of math and kind of how math is sort of ingrained in sort of a lot of the kind of cultural and family practices of the people. Is math, because again, when I think about math and I think about sort of how math is math taught in the same way in those communities as it would be here?
Yes. I mean, children go to school and they learn math in school. And then what I've been finding, at least preliminary in my research, is that, yeah, like a lot of times the perception, like it is in, like, I would say, like our communities is kind of like, yeah, children are going to learn like math at school. And when I say our communities, I mean here in the US, like, oh, children are going to learn math at school. And then a lot of times parents believe that, yes, they're primarily learning math at school and it can reinforce math learning in the home. But the perception kind of is that there's like this homeschool connections perception that math is something that is primarily taught in school and then can be reinforced in the home, which I think is a belief that also exists here. And is, I guess, I don't have children, as I mentioned, but yeah, if I did, I would probably have, before all of this, I'd probably have had that same assumption that, yeah, like they're going to learn math at school. And then, yeah, like math can be reinforced in the home through, different activities, whether that be like, well, I don't know, cooking or something.
And when you were doing these interviews, were you doing these in the Quechua language?
So as I mentioned, I'm not fluent in Quechua. So I primarily did the interviews in Spanish, and I would always ask the participant based off of, like I would say, we can do this interview in Spanish, we can do it in Quechua, based off your preferences, like what do you want to do? Most of the time, even the older ones who are Quechua dominant, I mean, primarily in Abancay, because most of the younger population has gone to formal schooling, they're Spanish dominant. Even like my siblings are Spanish dominant, even though they grew up with Quechua as their first language, because of formal schooling and just like the fact that most people, even if they do speak Quechua, they speak Spanish. So primarily you're just talking Spanish. So honestly, my sister, my siblings, and my sister especially, who even like her first and oldest, who I think I mentioned was like kind of raised by like my mama. He was also Quechua dominant, like before he went to formal schooling. Like even they are like Spanish dominant, not only in their lives but with each other. and where they speak Quechua to one another, which I find very interesting and fascinating. But yeah, so to get back to your original question about, what languages the interviews were done in. Yeah, so I'd ask, which language you prefer. Most people, by and large, if they did have some level of Spanish fluency, they would say Spanish. And I also had a lovely facilitator from the community who worked with me who spoke English, Quechua, and Spanish. So he would kind of act as a translator for me. And then when we were doing the Quechua interviews where the participants might have needed help or wanted to say certain things in Quechua, he would then translate for me. And I would be able to understand that way.
And so when did you start learning Quechua?
I have been learning Quechua since like 2015. This lovely mentor, she's amazing. Her name is Elva Ambia. She is a Quechua activist, Quechua teacher, Quechua author. Overall, like just a pillar of the Quechua diaspora community here in New York, who I found through her lovely film that she starred in called Living Quechua. It's a documentary, which was directed by an associate of mine named Christy, who actually also went to NYU as a doctoral student in linguistic anthropology. So she made this documentary about Elva. It's called Living Quechua. It's about Elva's efforts to keep Quechua alive as she lives here in New York. She came to this country when she was 17 years old, and she was a Quechua and Spanish speaker, and she reconnected with her desire to wanting to spread Quechua and also to continue to learn Quechua and to make Quechua a bigger part of her life when she was like in 2012. So that is when she founded like her first organization, which was originally called the Quechua New York Quechua Initiative, which then changed to New York Quechua Collective. And she has been through those two groups advocating for and diffusing and facilitating the learning of Quechua within New York since 2012, since she first developed the organization, which again, it was one organization, but it changed. Before that, she had been deeply involved in like Peruvian like culture. She had a dance group called Inga Kusisanko, who, dancing with, but then she was like moving on to more like focusing on the language. So I found her like through honestly a Google search online, and I was like, oh my God, there's this woman who's living in Brooklyn. And this is when I was first deciding I wanted to get back in touch with my biological family. I wanted to reconnect with them. And I was like, well, I know that I'm going to need like Quechua because, as I said, I've always known that my biological mom, is a monolingual Quechua speaker.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I'm going to need Quechua. So I was like, how do I learn Quechua? Like way back in 2015. So I just like Googled like Quechua, and Elva's movie came up, and I was like, wow, like this woman like lives in Brooklyn. Like,
amazing.
Can you believe that? Yeah. So I reached out to her via email, and she emailed back, and we met. She actually doesn't live that far from me. We are still very close to this day. I am hopefully going to be able to go see her on Wednesday, is 2 days from now. And yeah, that is like, then through workshops with her, through classes with her, I have been learning Quechua. I've also, now I learn with my family. I worked also with this amazing woman, Tanya, who she was here in New York for a little bit, but she's back in Peru, and we did this kind of language program where she's learning English. I needed help with Quechua. She's from Ayacucho, so Quechua is a little bit different. And we still keep in touch and try to get together to also have that language exchange. We usually try to do it at least once a week.
Wow. What's it been like being able to communicate with some of your monolingual family members, being able to speak some of this language now?
It's great. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I feel like my most used word is imatak, which is like, what? So I'm like, imatak this, imatak that, like everything. But it feels really good. I feel really happy when I'm able to communicate with, my mom, or like, some of her siblings who only speak Quechua, or some of my cousins who only speak Quechua. My brother's wives actually both only speak Quechua. So yeah, being able to communicate with them has been really great. It just feels really nice. I mean,
yeah.
It is. I mean, there has been research done that like the language that you hear in the womb, like so before you're born, like you're already like attuned and aware to. I'm very badly speaking about this research because not very I don't know it inside and out, but basically that you're attuned to the language that you hear in the womb, and that they did a study where later in life I don't know if they looked at adoptees or what it was, but basically people who hadn't heard the language, they heard it in the womb, and later in life they heard it again. And they found when looking at people's brains is that the brain lights up when they hear that language like they're a native speaker, even if they're not.
Wow.
I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
That is interesting. Yeah, yeah. Fascinating.
Quechua is very like hearing it or speaking it. It's very like, I don't know, like comforting or like calming. So yeah, it's nice, and I enjoy working on my Quechua like with my mama. Or yeah, she's always trying to help me with my pronunciation. And also, it's interesting. It's teaching. I've also taught my mama like things about Quechua in terms of like how it's perceived and taught,
Sure.
and like the different, like also like I'm like more familiar because I've met a lot of Quechua speakers from different regions, like here in the U.S. in the diaspora community. So I'm also familiar with like different ways in which it, like the language is spoken, or like telling her about like Quechua, which is an Ecuadorian. It's like the Ecuadorian Quechua, but it's called Quechua,
Mm.
showing her and teaching her about the differences with that and how like this is a language, and familiarizing her with that. So it's really been like a very collaborative exchange of like language and just different things that we learn about each other, which is
Wow.
nice. I really
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah, I've heard of the Quechua because I was in Ecuador in 2009 and spent some time up in kind of the Andes and went to the Otavalo market there
Oh,
and
yes, yes.
and which was just an incredible experience and just the from a distance the colors of the market are just mind blowing. It's just an incredible place to be
Yes,
and and I probably wasn't aware of it, but there was probably a lot of math happening in there. Um,
totally.
yeah,
No, completely.
yeah, yeah. How you probably don't have the sort of exact numbers, but roughly how large is the Quechua diaspora in the U.S.?
Question. So for me, and then now I'm wondering if I could like, if I don't know, I don't want to like lump like the Quechua, but also the Quechua diaspora, because the Quechua diaspora is very present in New York. There's this lovely radio station called Quechua Hatari. They're based out of the Bronx, and they have a radio station. Um, that program is entirely in Quechua. I have
Wow.
been lucky enough to visit and go there one time. I went there with Elva. She was being interviewed by them, and it was a really beautiful thing to see. And also Quechua Hatari, they're more than just the radio program. You know, they're a collective people who they're very active with the diaspora community, and they engage in like media, education, organizing, community organization, all different things. And yeah, I have been lucky enough to be in contact with one of their members, Charlie Urachima, who is an amazing person. But yeah, I was lucky enough to visit the radio station with Elva and watch her be interviewed. She was speaking Quechua and they were speaking Quechua. And they were able to understand one another because, again, the languages are similar. So
Yeah.
that was like a really
Yeah.
lovely and beautiful thing for me. Especially my husband is Ecuadorian, and his, although a lot of his family no longer speaks Quechua, he does have one great uncle who still does. And yeah, like it's nice to see. I've actually I his great uncle also speaks English though because he lived in the US for some time, and I've never again, I'm an English dominant person, so when we talk, we speak in English. Because again, my Spanish isn't 100% perfect either, especially speaking. I'm much better with understanding. But yeah, I remember once my husband's grandfather had asked, like, "Oh, have you ever tried to speak to him in Quechua?" Oh, yeah, and I was like, "No," I'm like embarrassed, but
Right.
no, yeah, like, yes, it's really beautiful to see like those type of interactions with all of us in the diaspora. I mean, we are different, but yeah, we are similar in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think that the diaspora community, if you think about like us as Quechua or Quechua, is quite large. And I would only know really about like New York, but I know that there's a big community also in the DMV area. Uh, there's this great group called the Quechua Project who does a lot of work with the diaspora community in that area. I know University of Madison, Wisconsin has a Quechua language program.
Wow.
And yeah, and I think that there is quite a community there as well, if I'm not mistaken. But those are like kind of like what I know about
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
I mean, the Quechua Alliance is also another great group that connects people from everywhere, and it's run by Americo Mendoza Mori, who is a
Mm.
professor at Harvard, and he has done amazing work as a professor of Quechua.
Wow.
He originally had, he started the Quechua program at UPenn and then moved on to Harvard. And he has just been amazing in creating the Quechua Alliance, which is a forum for where people can come and share their research and their ideas, projects they're working on, anything related to Quechua. And we can all gather as people of a diaspora. So I think it is quite large.
Fantastic, yeah. So you probably another year or so left in your doctoral program. What's sort of some of your kind of longer term plans once you're doctor?
Yeah, so I would say I'm probably not interested in continuing in academia,
Mm.
but I am interested in continuing my work and then also using what I've learned from my work. I really think that as I mentioned, I'm hoping to do another study on media as a context, like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
context. And I'm particularly interested in using all of what I've learned through my research into creating inclusive and diverse children's programming, specifically
Mm.
children's programming that has to do with Indigenous Quechua communities who I think are
Amazing.
underrepresented. They're underrepresented in developmental science and they are underrepresented for sure in educational digital media. So that
Mm.
is what I'm
Mm.
interested in.
Wow, so fascinating! Just incredible work, and you're incredible. Your life story is just amazing from its very beginnings, from it being adopted to learning about your history and learning about your family and reconnecting. And big props to your adopted parents too for keeping you connected to your kind of indigenous roots early on. I think that a lot of adopted kids from far off countries don't have that opportunity and often have to find it themselves. I've interviewed a lot of indigenous folks who are only really discovered their indigenous sort of identities sort of late in life, and and really kind of missed out on those pieces. So I mean, I think you were
Yeah.
you were lucky in some way to get to get that set of folks.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, my adoptive parents not only, aside from supporting me and telling me, who I was from day one, I've also been incredibly supportive in my journey to reconnect with my biological family, which also I
Mm.
know isn't always the case for many adoptees.
Mm-hmm.
Parents have never been anything but 100% supportive, maybe
Mm.
110% supportive, because a year after I found my family,
The third secret word is mother. Mother.
my
Yeah.
parents came to Peru with me again,
Yeah.
and they reconnected with my family as well.
Really
And
cool.
yeah, and that was amazing and great. And not an easy feat for them because by this time, I mean my dad has a number of years on my mom. So he was he was not that he was old, he's not
Yeah.
even 80 or anything, but he's,
Yeah.
and the first time that he went to Peru, the altitude was extremely hard on him.
Of course, yes.
So like about 10 years ago it was
Yeah.
even worse.
Yeah.
It was a difficult time. He
Yeah.
got altitude sick, and my mom
Yeah.
didn't get altitude sick the first time she was in Peru, but she got extremely altitude sick the time that she did come, and she had a really hard time. Actually, she went through, she had to get on, luckily, if anyone is interested in traveling to Peru and they're worried about altitude sickness, hotels do have like oxygen and things
Mm.
for if you need them. So my mom did actually. She had the oxygen tank, but she had a number of other different difficulties. Like she unfortunately fell down the stairs at the
Mm.
hotel.
No.
Yeah, just through an unfortunate like mishap. It was like the stairs were slippery or something. So she had like a time, and then she, like sometimes like the food is a little bit different. So like your stomach is adjusting also to that, but also
Mm-hmm.
digesting in altitude is different, which sometimes I think
Mm-hmm.
don't realize. I certainly didn't realize that. Yeah, so she, had like some stomach issues. She had that. She had the oxygen
Wow.
issue, but she toughed it out and she was there for me. And again, I really appreciate it.
I can relate. I spent a week in Ecuador suffering from altitude sickness, and
Oh, wow.
I was held up in bed for several days, and it was awful. And and I took my quote unquote altitude medication, and so on and so forth. But yeah, you really have to respect the height there.
Yeah, no, it's
Absolutely.
very true. I actually didn't realize like so I've never been altitude sick. And neither has
Mm-hmm.
my husband. So like when my parents came with us, we were like, "Oh my God, like this is like a
Mm-hmm.
whole new thing. And my dad was like, immediately when he got off in the plane in Cusco, he was like, oh my God, like, oh, I feel it. It's like you feel it immediately when you get off. And I was like, oh no, you know, I was very worried about them, but they, like I said, they toughed it out and they came. And you know, I really appreciate that because we were able to all like be, you know, together. They were able to meet my siblings, which they weren't able to do. Well, they did meet one of my siblings, and then they were able to see her again, but they were able to meet the rest of my siblings. That was really special. And it's a memory that I will always cherish. So.
Yeah, so cool. Jessica, it's been fascinating learning about Quechua culture, learning about you, learning about your research, and you know, I think a lot of folks will appreciate, especially some of the other names and you know, folks like Elva and then others to sort of, you know, connect more. Because I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there that you know, have some connection to you know, a Quechua life and may not know a lot about it. And I think this conversation will really maybe open some doors and hopefully you know, help some other folks connect with their communities. So really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Really cool.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for having me. I loved.
If you enjoyed this conversation, you might enjoy these interviews on the Behavior Speak podcast. Episode 172. ¿Quiénes somos? An exploration of Latinidad with Dr. Karina Jimenez Gomez, Dr. Sarah Lachago, and Dr. Denise Rios. Episode 173, Science of Learning Foreign Languages with Dr. Juliana Sequeira Cesar de Oliveira. And episode 182, Healing the Disconnect, Culture, Climate, and Community with Dr. Emma Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please follow us on Instagram @BehaviorSpeak.